This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you, Storm. Good afternoon, everyone. It is with great pleasure that the Institute of Latin American Studies at the School of Advanced Study is hosting today's Thyra and Alleyne Memorial Lecture, which is going to be delivered by Rachel Sieder. But before we begin with the lecture, Professor Alleyne, Director of the Institute of Latin American Studies, is going to introduce them.
Well, welcome everybody, and especially welcome to Rachel and Thyra. And also, it's nice to see some old faces here. Rachel is currently Senior Research Professor at CIESAS and also Associate Senior Researcher at Christian University Institute in Bergen. But as many of you probably know, she was at the Institute for many years, from 1993, I think, to 2007. And I know her quite well because I was also around at that time when I was contributing a master's course to the master's program. But in those early days, Rachel and I had another thing in common, and that was that we were both working on Honduras, and we must have been about the only people in the UK who were working on Honduras. I suspect, given the circumstances at the moment, there aren't many more working there today, unfortunately. So it's really nice to welcome Rachel, back. She has authored and edited 15 books and, of course, many other papers, and they cover, I think, as most of you probably know better than I do, the broad area of politics and the law. So she's covered various topics of human rights, indigenous rights, social movements, indigenous law, legal anthropology, the state and violence. Her most recent work has been on indigenous women in the law, and she's got a forthcoming book on demanding justice and security, indigenous women and legal pluralities in Latin America. And she's currently working on a manuscript entitled Contested Sovereignties, Indigenous Law, Violence and the State in Post-War Guatemala. Before we pass on to hear Rachel's lecture, I just want to mention a few words about the Trust Fund, which is actually supporting this lecture, which is the Thyra Alleyne Memorial Trust Fund. Thyra Alleyne is quite an interesting history. She was quite a formidable woman who, for 30 years, from 1916 to 1945, was principal of a hall of residence for women who were scholars at London University. It was established in 1882. And she was a great supporter of women's education, and actually in her 50s, in the 1920s, went on a 6-month world tour of women's higher education institutions throughout the world. She was highly respected by the students that stayed at the college, and who often sought her advice once they had left. She acted sort of as an agony aunt, I suppose, for people who left the hall and had problems with their lives. So there are letters, for example, in the Senate House Library seeking advice from her. What should they do? Because the parents had refused to support her marriage with someone from China. And so there's lots of really nice letters to her. So during the Second World War, she was still at College Hall and refused to leave London, and actually College Hall was bombed twice during that period, but she survived. So she's a particularly formidable woman. So it's particularly pleasing, I think, therefore, that given Thyra Alleyne's support of the education of women, that we have a female speaker with us tonight. But it's not, of course, just because Rachel is female that she's here. She is, as we all know, an outstanding scholar in her field who's contributed a lot to the area of politics and the law. So it's a real pleasure to welcome you back, and I'm looking forward to your lecture, as I'm sure many others are. But before we hand over to that, I think Anna wants to say a few words about process.
Yes, thank you. Basically, we are now going to listen to Rachel Sieder's lecture, and after that I will introduce Dr. Pilar Domingo, who will offer a few comments on Rachel's lecture before we take some questions from the floor. So without further ado, let's hear from Rachel on the topic of Indigenous struggles, legal pluralities and fragmented sovereignties, reflections on law, illegality and multiculturalism.
Well, good evening. It's a delight to be here and to see old friends and new faces. I want to thank very much the Institute of Latin American Studies for inviting me to give this lecture. Also the Thyra Alleyne Memorial Trust. It's good to be invited by all the formidable women in the university, which there are many and many sat here in this room indeed. To Linda, thank you very much for the invitation, and to Ainoa, who I didn't know before. She invited me to give this lecture, but it's been a real delight to get to know a little in the intervening period. For commenting, and to all of you for being here this evening. My title up here is Indigenous Struggles, Legal Pluralities and Fragmented Sovereignties, to reflect on the law, illegality and the multicultural state. So a lot, but I will try and focus down in the time that I have. Anthropologists, lawyers and others working in defence of Indigenous peoples' collective rights have long argued that legal life in Latin America is characterised by situations of legal pluralism. That's to say, by the simultaneous coexistence of different legal orders in the same social field. And for decades, those advocates, many of us, I include myself in that group, and a lot of us are organised in something called the Latin American Network of Legal Anthropology, the Red Latinoamericana de Antropología Jurídica, RELAJU. That network and scholars associated with it have documented the existence and the revitalisation of Indigenous law in many countries in the region. Well, the Indigenous law was generally or generically referred to by many Indigenous peoples' movements as derecho propio, our own forms of law. Indigenous law comprises then the different authorities, the established norms and the practices of communal and supracommunal systems of governance and dispute resolution. Those systems tend to exist mainly in rural regions, but also they've been reconfigured to some extent in urban areas of Latin America where there's been high indigenous migration. Those forms of law then, indigenous law, tend to draw on historical continuities, but they're highly dynamic and they're very, very diverse. So I'm generalizing across a huge swathe of difference. But as a general rule, we could say they tend to emphasize participation, be characterized by very extended deliberation, and an ethos of service to the collective. But they have also been criticized for excluding certain groups, such as women, which I've been working on and writing about quite a lot. I'm not going to talk about that so much this evening, but if people like, we can talk about that more in questions. Also migrants tend to be groups that can be excluded from Indigenous governance and justice systems. So then we could say that, like all forms of governance, they can be more or less inclusive and seen as more or less legitimate by those that are subject to them. Certainly, Indigenous systems of law and governance are always internally contested, and they're constantly evolving, they're dynamic. So I really don't want to give the impression that I'm talking about something fixed in stone. They're also very much rooted in specific places and histories and cultural identities. Why is Indigenous law important? Why have those of us that started off, as Rachel will remind me, working on politics and law rather than anthropology and law, come to be so interested in Indigenous people's law? Well, rights activists and advocates have argued for a very long time that there should be some degree of autonomy for these subaltern legal systems, as part of protecting Indigenous culture and ways of life. And those rights were first recognised in international law through International Labour Organization Convention 169, which was approved in 1989, and that committed the states that signed up to that treaty. It's still the only treaty that we have on Indigenous people's rights. And the states that signed up to that agreed that they would recognise their Indigenous populations and tribal populations' rights to exercise their own forms of law. And in 2007, we had the approval by the UN General Assembly of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that sets out a much stronger formulation for recognition of Indigenous law and talks about rights to self-determination for Indigenous people within the sovereignty of existing nation states, something that Rodolfo Stavenhagen, eminent Mexican sociologist, colleague who was special rapporteur for Indigenous peoples before the UN. And actually, we invited him many years ago to give a lecture around the corner here in the Chancellor's Hall, and he talked then about internal self-determination. And that is effectively what the UN Declaration has formulated, and finally it has been approved after 20 years of struggling to get that approved at the UN. Also in Latin America, since the mid-2000s, the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has underlined the centrality of Indigenous peoples' forms of law as a means to safeguard their rights to historic territories, and as their exercise of law being central to the exercise of other key rights, such as prior consultation to ensure free, prior and informed consent about development projects or other government initiatives that will affect their ways of life. As you all probably know, the rights of Indigenous collectives to exercise their own forms of law were also recognised to a greater or lesser extent by the first and second waves of multicultural or plurinational constitutional reforms in Latin America in the 1990s and the 2000s. And we've had lots of work identifying the different constitutional trends in the recognition of legal pluralism over time, so kind of mapping from, say, the recognition in Colombia after the 1991 constitution of the first Jurisdicción Especial Indígena, the special indigenous jurisdiction, right through to the 2009 Bolivian constitution, which sets out provisions for the legalization of indigenous autonomy. So I'm not going to go into the detail of the constitutional arrangements throughout the region, but the point that I really want to underline first here is that by ratifying these international legal instruments and by approving different constitutional, multicultural reforms, legal pluralism was formally recognized and endorsed as an organizing principle for state legality in Latin America. And that is new. That's really a paradigm shift in thinking about law in the region, involving a move away from what prevailed throughout most of the 20th century, which is this idea of a correspondence between national identity, nation state, and a unitary form of law. So legal pluralism, at least in name, has been now recognized as a fundamental organizing principle of state legality. But what has this recognition of indigeneity and rights through law meant in practice for Indigenous peoples and their struggles to defend their territories, their cultural identities and livelihoods? How should we understand the legally plural state in Latin America? What kind of opportunities and risks do those new socio-legal scenarios entail for grassroots struggles for justice? A lot of recent scholarship, and some very, very interesting recent scholarship, has considered the impacts of what this move to the law does, or what impact it has on the identities and the organizational processes of Indigenous peoples, including those communities that perhaps didn't think of themselves as Indigenous before, but have come to self-identify as Indigenous after or in response to this multicultural constitutional term. A lot of the scholarship has drawn on the heuristic binary put forward by the socio-legal scholar Boaventura de Sousa Santos when he asked whether law offers new avenues for emancipation or simply imposes new forms of regulation. So can law be a tool in counter-hegemonic struggles? For example, when Indigenous people will judicialise their collective claims to land, to political autonomy, their rights to prior consent, do those contested engagements really provide evidence of what Cesar Rodriguez and Santos have called counter-hegemonic globalization, legal globalization from below? Can we believe in this counter-hegemonic promise of law? Can the legal recognition of Indigenous lands and autonomies and jurisdictions, which we've seen in this last 20 years, really serve as a means to protect Indigenous life worlds from the predations of late capitalist development? Or rather, does it open the way to their colonization by hegemonic statist logic? So that's one of the founding debates in a lot of this literature. And there's some very, very interesting work being done in recent years, particularly in Colombia, on these questions. Well, it's impossible to answer those questions in the abstract. We can certainly identify some common patterns in the region, and the historical dynamics between Indigenous people and states, of course, vary enormously between and across national territories and local histories. So I should say that what I'm talking to here, my reflection is really based on recent developments in Guatemala, where I've done most of my work, and Mexico, where I've lived for the last 8 years. Specifically my work, but also that of my colleagues and students with different Indigenous peoples' movements in both countries over the last few years. The central proposition I want to put to you this evening is that the limited and highly ambiguous recognition of Indigenous peoples' collective rights that was characteristic of neoliberal forms of multicultural recognition in both Mexico and Guatemala. So limited multicultural recognition is important ones, but if we compare, say, to Colombia, on paper at least, limited. That, combined with the increasingly violent nature of governance in Indigenous regions of both countries, has given rise to new forms of resistance, which we can identify, I think, as political and social expressions of what I am calling Indigenous sovereignties. What are Indigenous sovereignties then? Well, they are perhaps best understood as claims for political and territorial control. And they combine two elements. Firstly, attempts to re-articulate community and territory as spaces of self-government or self-defense. So derecho propio being re-articulated as a claim to control over territory, very often to try and keep other forces out of that territory, at bay. And the second aspect or characteristic is the disputes over the very nature of state legality, which occur through the judicialization of Indigenous people's claims in domestic and international courts. Anthropologists have written quite a lot about sovereignty in recent years, and they've distinguished between legal and de facto forms of sovereignty. So, for example, Thomas Blum Hansen and Finn Stepetat define legal sovereignty as the right to govern, the legitimate right to govern, and de facto sovereignty as the right over life, and I'm quoting them, the ability to kill, discipline, and punish with impunity. A lot of the theorists have taken their cue from the work of Giorgio Agamben in recent years, emphasizing very much the violence of sovereignty, both in de jure and de facto forms. But there are other anthropologists working on sovereignty who have suggested that there's really been too much focus on the violence of sovereignty, and we need to shift our focus to the ways of life that sustain sovereignty as well, rather than just thinking about sovereignty as power of exclusion and power and violence. And that latter conception, thinking about the ways of life that sustain sovereignty, seems to me to be fruitful for analysing indigenous sovereignties, because I think they're best understood as claims for alternative ways of being in the world. Indigenous sovereignties then represent popular constructions of law and justice. They can be understood as a form of legal consciousness, so you could link in very much to debates around legal consciousness. They're a form of identity. And they're constituted through everyday practices and projected through legal imaginations of indigenous collectivities and their allies, who claim them as a right. But they exist in a very liminal space between being de jure and de facto. And in this way, I think indigenous sovereignties are signalling the very porous and indeterminate boundaries of what the legal is in Latin America. The fact that the law is unstable, that it's dynamic, and that it's constantly contested. So they're mobilizing languages of stateness and using those languages of stateness and languages of the law in order to stake claims to territories, to natural resources, and political autonomy. And that reflects the current global purchase of the language of the law as a language of politics, the legal as the predominant language of politics. But it's also, I think, characteristic of Latin America in the longue durée. As Mark Goodale has noted, since the colonial period, broader projects for social and economic transformation in Latin America tend to adopt the idioms of the law, in part because the legal is the key institutional and intellectual mode through which Latin America's historic power imbalances have been justified and reinforced. I'm citing. So the dynamics between these two elements that I'm pointing to as constitutive of indigenous sovereignties, this reconstitution of derecho propio and the resort to hegemonic forms of law, aren't simple and they're not straightforward. This in turn raises important questions about the counter-hegemonic potentials of the legal. The second point that I want to underline tonight is that these kinds of forms of claim-making occur within a broader context of fragmented legal norms and sovereign power. And those fragmented sovereignties are characterized by competition and conflict between different transnationalized actors who are pursuing territorial control, or new forms of governance, or new forms of political economy. I'll try and talk about these a little more when I come on to some of my examples, but for example, transnational mining companies, drug cartels in Mexico. We're looking at contexts of fragmented sovereignties, highly competitive forms of fragmentation. Those fragmented sovereignties are generated in part through law, and particularly through legal pluralism at the global scale. So you have overlappings of human rights, commercial law, soft law mechanisms, and other forms of global ordering, and they're all superimposed. But they're also configured through highly violent, coercive, and illegal means, and that's particularly evident in disputes surrounding extractive industry projects in indigenous territories. So actors there do include transnational companies and their local allies, usually powerful law firms locally, particularly. Many state institutions, so national, federal, municipal authorities, the military, multiple different police corps in the case of Mexico, particularly notorious also private security firms that are often hired by the companies to police the sites of extractive developments. And then in some contexts, illegal armed groups or paramilitaries linked to drug cartels generically tend to be referred to as el crimen organizado, which is kind of capacious category to which many fit. So, as I will illustrate, within those scenarios, indigenous peoples' forms of law and governance, their derecho propio, is increasingly illegalized in practice. So it's being recognized through the constitutional reforms and through the ratification of international instruments, but on the ground, as I will hope to show you, they're increasingly illegalized in practice. So clearly the boundaries between what is the state and what's not, or what's legal and what's illegal, are increasingly blurred within these contemporary transnational forms of legal pluralism. And indeed that ambiguity seems to be a key factor in facilitating the processes of accumulation and dispossession that threaten the very existence of indigenous peoples across the continent. I was going to talk a little about multicultural recognition in Mexico and Guatemala, but I think I'm going to go straight to my examples and talk through some of the multicultural recognition through those. But just to say that at the turn of the century, in both countries, we saw the expansion of, as indeed across the whole region, of extractive industries such as mining, hydropower, tourism, biofuels, facilitated through the approval of new laws, a raft of new mining laws, water laws, and other legislative measures. Some of those legal transformations in the countries were promoted by international bodies such as the WTO and the World Bank. The World Bank is particularly important in the mining code reforms across the region. And they've involved the global redefinition of the rule of law and the extension of Anglo-Saxon legal concepts of exclusive private property. Hugo Matei and Laura Nader, in their book Plunder, which was published in 2008, talk about the way in which this hegemonic form of law was presented as being neutral, technical, as necessary for the effective functioning of the market. Remember, they published this in 2008. Yet in practice, it was used to facilitate and legitimize the dispossession of lands, mineral resources, water, and labor in favor of transnational capital. So what we have seen is a growth of local mobilization and resistance to these initiatives. That's always complex, it's always contested. Invariably, you have divisions within communities between those who support and those who oppose such developments, and those tend to build on existing local factionalism and competitions for power. But nonetheless, as the pressure on territories and natural resources increased, community activists increasingly turned to the law in their attempts to enforce their collective rights as indigenous peoples. Andrew Canessa has argued that indigeneity always implies a relationship with the state, and he's emphasized the need to distinguish between indigeneity as a language of resistance and here, when he's referring to contemporary Bolivia, indigeneity as a language of governance. I think despite everything, and there's much more to be said about both countries, in the kind of long historical durée, but today, very much in Guatemala and Mexico, indigeneity remains a language of resistance. And it is resistance through indigeneity that's increasingly come to mean a resort to the law. So that includes strategic litigation to try and enforce indigenous people's internationally recognized collective rights before national courts, and also within the inter-American human rights system. And at the same time, we've seen communities and political movements exercising de facto sovereignty in defense of their lands and livelihoods by strengthening their culturally distinct forms of place-based law and governance, or derecho propio. I'll give you two examples to try and illustrate this exercise of indigenous sovereignty, but also its fragility and the complex dynamics that exist between derecho propio on the one hand and resort to hegemonic forms of law on the other. In April 2011, the comuneros of San Francisco Cherán in the Purépecha region of the state of Michoacán, Mexican state of Michoacán, placed barricades and roadblocks at the entrance to their town to defend themselves and the communal forests against the predations of organized crime in league with corrupt local government officials. forces that local residents at the time referred to simply as los malos. New forms of neo-extractivism in the Purépecha region had meant the implantation of logics of terror amongst the population of the highlands, including extortion rackets, kidnapping, and growing paramilitary violence. Some of the interpretations link those phenomena to broader trends to transform the region's communal forests into agro-industrial lands dedicated to lucrative avocado farming, el oro verde, green gold, that's what it's called. And in response to these predations, the inhabitants of Cherán organized groups to patrol and protect their communal forests. I had one of my students out with these patrols, heavily armed guys going, and women going around the perimeters of the communal forest. Thankfully, she didn't show me the photos until she'd been doing her fieldwork for a couple of months. But these groups were there to patrol and protect the communal forests. They also set up this tree nursery, which was staffed by women to develop and commercialize their natural resources. And this is the tree nursery. They also engaged in numerous communal activities to renew and reaffirm their rituals, customs, and structures of governance. Following the initial blockade, they subsequently declared themselves to be an indigenous municipality, free from the influence of political parties, and they claimed a right as indigenous peoples to select their municipal authorities according to their own uses and customs, usos y costumbres, and they elected a council of keris, or elders. Legislation permitting municipalities to govern themselves according to usos y costumbres has existed in the Oaxaca state since the mid-1990s, but no such law existed in Morelia. At that point, Morelia had not passed a secondary law to implement the 2001 constitutional reform, which recognises certain rights to self-determination of indigenous peoples. So since their local uprising in 2011, the inhabitants of Cherán, which numbers about 15,000 people, have continued to negotiate with the state government of Michoacán and the federal government in their attempts to defend more autonomous forms of politics. And that's occurred and been maintained in the face of the inevitable tensions and political interventions that have followed what was really a period of hyper-mobilization in 2011. In November of that year, aided by a collective of young legal professionals based in Morelia, the capital of Michoacán, the communal authorities of Cherán won a case at the country's highest electoral tribunal, the Electoral Tribunal, the Tribunal Electoral del Poder Judicial de la Federación, the Federal Electoral Tribunal, which confirmed that they did have rights to local governance based on their usos y costumbres. But this victory was short-lived. The governor and state congress of Michoacán subsequently passed a reform of the local constitution. Ostensibly, they did that to strengthen protections for indigenous people's rights, but they did it without consulting with the comuneros of Cherán, or indeed with any indigenous community in Michoacán state. Mexico was one of the first countries to ratify ILO Convention 169, and one of the things that ILO Convention 169 commits states to do is to have processes of prior consultation with indigenous peoples when measures are going to be adopted that are going to affect them. So the Michoacán state government did not consult on this fundamentally important question, either with the comuneros of the municipality that were making the appeal or with anybody else. So the revised constitution, which supposedly was going to put into place, bring the local constitution in line with Article 2 of the federal constitution, which, as I said, had been approved 10 years earlier, which did recognize rights to self-determination for indigenous peoples and communities. But the revised constitution of Michoacán state didn't mention the rights of indigenous communities to elect their municipal government according to usos y costumbres. So they basically denied what the federal tribunal had said that Cherán had the right to do. And what that signalled was a refusal of the local governing class to cede power and their determination to continue controlling political life in the municipalities of the state. So, what did they do? The authorities of Cherán and their lawyers again decided to make a strategic appeal to the law, and this time they presented a constitutional writ, an amparo, to the Mexican Supreme Court. They alleged that their constitutional rights to free, informed, and prior consultation, which had been set out in ILO 169, and which since June 2011 were supposedly now part of constitutional law. Mexico passed a federal constitutional reform, important reform, in June 2011, which effectively means, it's open to contestation, but effectively means that international human rights conventions are now part of the constitutional bloc, constitutional law in Mexico. So it makes it much easier for lawyers to do the sort of thing that they did in the case of Cherán, to go to the Supreme Court and argue that their constitutional rights to prior consultation have been violated, appealing to ILO 169, which is supposedly now part of Mexican constitutional law. The Supreme Court's ruling came 3 years later, in 2014. It was pretty convoluted and very ambiguous. It was a victory, but a partial victory. The court did uphold the right to consultation, to prior consultation, but only for the municipality of Cherán, not for any other indigenous municipality in Michoacán to whom the reform of the state constitution would apply. And that meant that effectively what they had done was endorse usos y costumbres for Cherán, but blocked its possibilities for extension to other indigenous municipalities. And the litigation really served to highlight both the lack of effective recognition of indigenous self-determination in practice, and also the pretty schizophrenic attitude of Mexican high courts to indigenous rights. So we've seen opposing criteria for similar cases, wildly contrasting opinions between the two salas of the court, and great differences between the kind of institutional tendencies which were set out by the last presidency of the Supreme Court and the positions of various different judges and ministers. However, through their exercise of sovereignty, the comuneros and citizens of Cherán continue to construct alternative conceptions of security, politics, and economy, which are based on territorial control, revitalized ethnic identity, and preservation and exploitation of their communally owned and managed natural resources. And those conceptions stand in marked contrast to the kind of militarized frameworks of security and development which are defended currently by the federal and state government. The second example I want to talk to you about is in Guatemala, where we can see similar phenomena of indigenous or place-based sovereignties and legal entanglements with hegemonic forms of law. In a recent publication with my colleague Santiago Bastos, we've argued that the nationwide protests that seem to resist the onslaught of mining and oil and hydroelectric projects since the early 2000s have led to the strengthening of local communities as spaces of self-government and as the locus of the political now for the indigenous movement. Throughout the 1990s in Guatemala, the Pan-Mayan movement was very much focused on the form of the constitution, prior to that on the peace accords and was articulated to the peace accords. And that national focus really has shattered now, and the locus of the political, of the movement is much more local. Yet, these incipient localized sovereignties are subject to internal tensions and systematic violence and criminalization. And those tendencies are most evident in confrontations with international mining corporations and their national allies. Many of you will know, I imagine, something about this case, in 2003, the Canadian-based multinational Gold Corp opened its Marlin mine in San Miguel, Ixtahuacan, in San Marcos province. It's the second largest open-pit gold mine in Latin America. It started to operate in 2005, And on the 18th of June 2005, the municipality of Sipacapa, the nearest municipality, or the municipality most affected by the mine, organised a popular consultation, or a referendum, which overwhelmingly rejected the installation of the mine. The mine was already there working. But, they organised this referendum. They argued that it had validity on the basis of ILO Convention 169, the right to prior consultation. Guatemala ratified ILO Convention 169 in 2006. Sorry, 1996. And they also, interestingly, appealed to the municipal code, the 2002 municipal code, and the laws referring to decentralisation and local government, which also recognised the authority of traditional bodies such as community assemblies. So they're arguing their right on the basis of decentralisation, national law, but also on the basis of international law, ILO 169. There had been a couple of previous instances of consultations, but this vote really seemed to signal that impoverished Mayan villages could stand up to a giant like gold claw. And it detonated a phenomenon which soon acquired national and transnational proportions. It was a parastatal movement of what were called good faith community consultations, consultas comunitarias de buena fe. They took hold throughout the country in response to the lack of guarantees of this right to informed prior consultation to secure informed consent. The UN declaration has a much stronger formulation. ILO 169 talks about prior consultation, but the UN declaration talks about prior consultation to achieve informed consent, FPIC, free, prior and informed consent. And that is what is increasingly invoked by these movements. So by 2013, over 500,000 people had participated in such consultations about mining initiatives and hydroelectric projects in more than 60 municipalities. That's about 20% of all the municipalities in Guatemala. And some communities and regional organizations mobilized against existing projects, and others tried to stop concessions being issued to prospective investors. See some of these consults. It says we demand the respect and the compliance with the community consultation in Puspanta carried out on 29th of October 2010. However, these community consultations appear to have little impact on state policies to promote extractive industries, and they would kind of reach a high point in 2013 and then they decline. And since then, conflicts have grown. Villages have tried to block the installation of projects which have been approved without their consent. Typically, company representatives turn up during the exploratory stage of development, no advance warning. They gain access to a site through a limited number of people, some municipal officials, or else they buy off or intimidate those who oppose their entry to a given locality. Criminal charges have been brought against an increasing number of community activists for taking part in direct actions, such as roadblocks or protests. Others have been threatened, some beaten, a number of them assassinated. In San Marcos, villages and families divided for and against the mine. The company bought off municipal and communal authorities, and a lot of the villagers came to support the entry of the company, and that provoked a deep sense of betrayal and loss amongst those who remained in opposition. So the divisions around these projects really become incredibly entrenched and ingrained and are extraordinarily painful for people in the locality. Women who were protesting at the entrance to the mine were roughed up by the community security guards, who then spread rumours that they'd been sexually assaulted, so to try and make problems with their families. Lawsuits and arrest warrants were issued against a number of local residents of the company's behest. For example, these 8 women leaders from the village of Agel had detention orders issued against them in 2008. They were accused of damaging company property because they kept taking down power pylons that had just been dumped in the middle of their land. Those orders weren't finally repealed until 2012, after there had been numerous mobilisation by civic organisations and individuals in their defence of 4 years that those women had criminal charges hanging over them. Legalised resistance to gold course operations generated complex effects on the ground. There was an appeal to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, which was taken by Guatemalan environmental and human rights activists, and the petitioners alleged that the mining concession was issued and operations had begun without prior, free and informed consultation and consent of the affected communities. And they said in the petition that that meant grave consequences for the life, personal integrity, environment and property of the affected people, since the Salat River and its tributaries, on which the mine depends, are the only sources of water for their consumption and subsistence activities. And the petition detailed how the wells and the springs had dried up and how the heavy metals from mining activities had a negative effect on the health of community members. I was actually invited to be a judge in a popular health tribunal in Sipacapa, which was an opportunity for many of the villagers to come and talk about the health impacts of the mine. And it was really quite shocking to hear that and to see many of the impacts of the water contamination. So the Inter-American Commission requested that the Guatemalan government suspend the activities of Goldcorp while it assessed the merits of the case. However, there was then a change in position by the mayor of Sipacapa, who'd been one of the key plaintiffs in the case to the Commission, and the precautionary measures were subsequently reduced to mandating that the company provide clean drinking water for residents. And that effectively blocked the case from advancing from the Commission to the court, to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And so the mine continues to operate. The knowledge and the experiences of villagers were discounted in attempts to make the company accept its responsibility for environmental pollution. Their accounts of harm couldn't stand up in court, as there was no scientific baseline studies of community health before the arrival of the mine. So the stories that the villagers told of poisoned water, of sick children, of the disappearance of the birds and the animals in the region just didn't count as credible evidence in formal legal petitions. As my colleague Mona McLeod, who worked with the Women for Mahel, has argued, judicial actions by environmentalists and anti-globalization activists, doctors, lawyers, and even regional and national indigenous and social movements tend to operate in spheres that are unreachable or unintelligible for many community members. So transnational anti-mining judicialization and protest, sorry, I knew I should have turned my phone off before starting. Transnational anti-mining judicialization and protests can leave Indigenous men and women voiceless as passive victims whose sense of moral grievance might remain untranslated and unheard in these processes of judicialization. And indeed, a lot of anthropological studies have revealed the complex effects of engagements with the languages and instruments of domestic and international law. On the one hand, judicialization endorses the dominant logics of law and understandings of entitlements as rights. Yet the subtleties of local narratives about justice are often lost in processes of political and legal translation into the idiom of rights. And there have been some very interesting recent books, two particular ones by Marisol de la Cadena and Fabiana Lee, where they've talked about identity and place-based movements to defend territory, natural resources and livelihoods, and the ways in which those reject commodified understandings of nature as property and instead articulate alternative forms of knowledge claims and understandings through their everyday practices. And I would countenance that such alternative claims and understandings often remain unheard when politics moves to the legal sphere. As John and Jean Komarov pointed out, the resort to the law serves to secure an illusion of commensurability across difference in these times of ever-increasing inequalities. And it frequently functions as a means to translate incommensurable damage to environment, to lives, to collective histories of belonging into financial compensation. So law and money as means of making the incommensurable commensurable. I'm running out of time. Five more minutes. Okay, or 10 minutes. And I will start. How can theories of legal pluralism contribute to our analysis of new state forms and indigenous sovereignties? That's kind of a big question I'm trying to grapple with. Certainly, the kind of new legal pluralism studies, the old legal pluralism, not the literature divides it into kind of old and new, and the old looked at multiple legal orders within nation states, colonial law and supporting forms of law. And the more recent wave, the new wave of legal pluralism studies is much more concerned with transnational and international dimensions of legal ordering and the declining authority of states in processes of legal norm setting. But I think while a lot of the literature, and certainly some of the fields that didn't accept legal pluralism before, lawyers now study legal pluralism as well as legal sociologists and legal anthropologists, so there's an acceptance of legal pluralism, but there's much less emphasis on the changing dynamics between the legal and the illegal within those legally plural landscapes. And I think that focus on those dynamics might help to illuminate the apparent paradox that I've highlighted here. On one hand, you've had indigenous people's rights and forms of law being recognised, legalised through successive multicultural constitutional reforms and the development of international instruments and standards. We've had indigenous peoples turning to counter-hegemonic uses of the law to try and make those rights justiciable in practice, and sometimes they've had notable legal victories. But at the same time, indigenous peoples are increasingly subject to systematic state and non-state violence and to criminalisation, and their efforts to defend their territories and their livelihoods are increasingly branded as illegal by government and private sectors. So I think this focus on the dialectic between the legalization and illegalization, every time we legalize something, we make something else illegal. It's something that we really need to be thinking about much more in our consideration of legal pluralism and the state. And some of the new directions in that field do suggest a focus on these ambiguous divisions and continuities between the legal and the illegal, and ask what role do they play in securing new forms of neoliberal governance. Again, the Komarovs have written about the need to shift away from the debates in legal anthropology that just focus on a concern with legal pluralism per se, and ask rather what's the relationship between legal pluralism or between law and governance in the contemporary world. I was going to talk to you about one more example, but I think I'm going to skip that in interest of time. And just say, in conclusion then, that the examples that I've talked to you about this evening, Cheran and Sipakapa, point to, I think, alternative logics of sovereignty emerging what Vinadas and Paul once termed the margins of the state. That is social spaces that supposedly don't have clearly defined order or law, or with populations that are insufficiently socialized into dominant understandings of law. And the legitimacy of what I've termed here indigenous sovereignties is ultimately not given by formal recognition through constitutions or judicial rulings, but rather through social and political praxis in contexts of highly fragmented and contradictory normative orders. So ethnic identity is just one dimension of indigenous sovereignties. These are sites of autonomy, they're very fragile, they're always contested, but really I think they constitute claims to forms of sociality, which contrast with dominant tropes of individual advancement and ever more militarized forms of development and security that are promoted by national and transnational elites. By resorting to strategic litigation and non-violent forms of protest, these different actors dispute the very legality of the state. But inevitably, those legal entanglements can never fully translate people's claims and grievances, and that resort to law may generate contradictory effects. As for the different cases I've referred to, well, the prospects for maintaining those localized forms of sovereignty vary enormously across time and place. They depend a lot on the cohesiveness and the resilience of communal institutions and their ability to exercise control over their community members and their territorial resource. And that's further complicated by illegalities and fragmented sovereignties of a different order, which I would have talked about more in my third case, which is the penetration of organized crime into local spheres of governance and the militarization of the war against drugs. State formations in Mexico and Central America are increasingly militarized, increasingly authoritarian and violent, and they're characterized by protection rackets of all kinds and ever closer relationships between state actors and criminal networks. The expanding territorial presence of drug cartels competing for sovereign power with each other, with different institutions of the state, has increased division within not just indigenous communities, but in general, factionalism and fear. We also have seen the growing criminalization of indigenous people's social movements, and that points to the authoritarian uses of law by state and private actors. So definitions of what is illegal are clearly related to new inequalities and exclusions by designating certain individuals, groups, or practices, such as derecho propio, as unacceptable. What I've suggested here then is we take up the challenge to consider the ways in which legally plural configurations secure different forms of governance today. For legal anthropologists, I think this points to the need to analyze the dialectical relationship between plural forms of legality and illegality, and structural and other forms of violence, and how power and modes of governance are changing. And such a research agenda can help us continue to evaluate the legacies of nearly 3 decades now of multicultural legal reform in Latin America, as well as the transformative potentials of different constellations of legal pluralism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for